The needle went into Marcellus Williams' arm at exactly 6 p.m. on September 24th, 2024. 10 minutes later, he was gone. But the controversy that consumed Missouri for 2 decades died with him, and what emerged from those final moments would shake the foundation of American capital punishment. Williams never touched the murder weapon. DNA proved it. The knife that killed former St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter Felicia Gayle in 1998 carried genetic material from an unknown male, not Williams. 26 years of legal battles couldn't change that scientific fact. Yet Missouri executed him anyway. This wasn't a case about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about power, about a system so invested in being right that it would kill a man even when its own prosecutor begged them to stop. St. Louis County's chief prosecutor filed a motion to overturn Williams' conviction, citing evidence of innocence. Gayle's family pleaded for life imprisonment instead. The Innocence Project presented witness recantations and prosecutorial misconduct. Missouri said no to all of them. In his final statement, Williams whispered, "All praise be to Allah in every situation." He'd spent his last day with his imam, eating chicken wings for his final meal, and maintained his innocence until the pentobarbital stopped his heart. What does it mean when killing someone becomes more important than questioning whether they actually committed the crime? This execution would become the catalyst for a national reckoning about irreversible justice in an imperfect system. Stealing had become a way of life for Williams, but that wasn't where his story began. Before the headlines, before the controversy, before his name became synonymous with one of America's most disputed executions, Marcellus Williams was a 23-year-old black man navigating life in St. Louis during the late 1990s. Those who knew Williams before August 11, 1998, would remember a complex individual caught between circumstances and choices. He wasn't born into privilege. Few in his neighborhood were. The streets of St. Louis had their own rhythm, their own harsh mathematics of survival, and Williams had learned to move within that reality. By the summer of 1998, Williams had already established a pattern that would prove prophetic in the worst possible way. Police had caught him running down the street on August 31st, 1998, after he robbed a downtown St. Louis donut shop at gunpoint. Less than 6 weeks earlier, Williams, along with 2 other men, had robbed a Burger King where he had previously worked. These weren't sophisticated crimes. They were desperate acts by someone who seemed to be spiraling. Yet here's what makes Williams' story different from countless others. The crime that would ultimately cost him his life wasn't one of these documented robberies. It was a murder he would spend the next 26 years claiming he never committed, a claim that would eventually be supported by DNA evidence, prosecutors, and even the victim's own family. The man who walked into that execution chamber in September 2024 was 55 years old, having spent more of his adult life on death row than he had as a free man. Prison had changed him in ways both visible and profound. Where once there had been a young man making desperate choices, there was now someone who had found faith, who had become a student of Islamic teachings, who had maintained his innocence with unwavering consistency for more than 2 decades. Understanding Marcellus Williams requires understanding the St. Louis of the late 1990s, a city wrestling with economic decline, racial tension, and a kind of urban decay that creates both desperation and opportunity in equal measure. This wasn't the gleaming arch and downtown renewal projects that tourists might see. This was a place where young black men faced limited options and abundant obstacles. Williams moved through this landscape like many others of his generation, caught between promise of legitimate work and the immediate allure of easier money. The Burger King where he had worked represented one path. The robberies he committed represented another. Neither path led where he probably imagined they would. St. Louis in 1998 was also a place where the justice system operated with its own set of assumptions and biases. When crimes occurred in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods like University City, where Felicia Gayle lived, the pressure to solve them quickly and decisively was immense. The contrast between Williams' world and Gayle's world would become central to understanding how this case unfolded. The story of Marcellus Williams underscores a racial injustice in our legal system and so much more. The geography of his life, growing up black in economically disadvantaged parts of St. Louis, would intersect with the geography of the crime in ways that seemed to predetermine the outcome long before the first witness took the stand. Daniel Pickers arrived at his gated University City home to a horrific scene. He found the lifeless body of his wife, Felicia Gayle. She had been stabbed 43 times with a butcher's knife. The scene that greeted him that August evening would haunt not just him, but an entire community and eventually the entire nation. Felicia Lisha, Gayle wasn't just any victim. By all accounts, the victim was a model citizen. Felicia, also known as Lisha, Gayle had been a St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter, someone whose job was to shine light on stories others preferred to keep hidden. At 42, she represented everything that University City valued: education, professional achievement, civic engagement. Her gated community home stood as a symbol of security and success in a city where both could be elusive. The violence that ended her life was staggering in its intensity. She had been stabbed up to 43 times, and a large butcher's knife was found lodged in her neck. She also had stab wounds to her back, thigh, and 2 more in her neck. Authorities described offensive wounds to her hands and arms, including a large gash in her right elbow. This wasn't a crime of passion that escalated quickly. This was prolonged, sustained violence that spoke to either rage or complete disconnect from human empathy. But here's where the story takes its first crucial turn toward controversy. The evidence that would eventually convict Marcellus Williams was circumstantial at best, and much it would later be called into question. No fingerprints linked him to the scene. No witnesses placed him at Gayle's home. No DNA evidence linked him to the crime. What prosecutors did have were 2 witnesses whose credibility would become central to the case, and to the decades of doubt that followed. The investigation that followed Gayle's murder was typical of its time and place. Thorough in some ways, rushed in others, and influenced by assumptions that seemed more rooted in social geography than forensic science. When police began looking for suspects, they weren't searching among Gayle's professional colleagues or social circle. They were looking in the parts of St. Louis where young black men with criminal records lived and moved. This is where Williams' prior robberies became not just part of his criminal history, but the thread that connected him to a murder he insisted he never committed. The same desperation that drove him to rob fast food restaurants will become the prosecutorial thread that tied him to Felicia Gayle's kitchen, to the butcher knife that ended her life, to a crime scene he claimed he never saw. The night of August 11, 1998, created 2 victims: Felicia Gayle, whose life was taken with shocking violence, and arguably Marcellus Williams, whose next 26 years would be consumed by fighting for his life against charges he maintained were false. The intersection of their stories, a respected white journalist and a young black man with a criminal record, would expose every fault line in America's approach to justice. What makes this case extraordinary isn't just what happened that night, but what didn't happen. A DNA analysis excluded Williams as the source of DNA on the murder weapon. The knife that killed Gayle carried genetic material, but it wasn't Williams. This fact, established through modern forensic science, would cast a shadow over everything that followed: the investigation, the trial, the conviction, and ultimately, the execution. The question that would haunt the next quarter century was this: if Williams didn't leave DNA on the murder weapon, and if no other physical evidence tied him to the scene, how did he end up on death row for Felicia Gayle's murder? The answer lies in the intersection of witness testimony, prosecutorial ambition, and a justice system that sometimes values closure over certainty. The trial of Marcellus Williams unfolded like countless others in American courtrooms, with prosecutors painting a narrative of guilt and defense attorneys struggling to create reasonable doubt against the emotional weight of a heinous crime. But this case carried additional burdens. The pressures saw a high-profile murder in an affluent community, the racial dynamics of a black defendant accused of killing a white victim, and evidence that even at the time seemed thin by modern standards. His conviction was based on the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses who were paid for their testimony. This fact alone should have raised red flags. In a case with no physical evidence connecting Williams to the crime scene, the prosecution's entire case rested on witnesses who had financial incentives to testify. One witness received payment for information leading to Williams' arrest. Another was facing their own criminal charges and saw testimony against Williams as a potential path to leniency. A jury convicted Marcellus Williams of 1 count of first-degree murder, first-degree burglary, and first-degree robbery, and 2 counts of armed criminal action. Williams was sentenced to death on the murder conviction. The verdict came after deliberations that seemed to accept the prosecution's narrative despite the absence of forensic evidence linking Williams to crime. What the jury didn't know, what nobody could have known in 2001, was that advancing DNA technology would eventually prove what Williams had been saying all along. The genetic material on the murder weapon belonged to someone else entirely. This revelation wouldn't come for years, long after Williams had been sentenced to die, long after his appeals had begun winding through the courts, long after the machinery of execution had been set in motion. The conviction represented more than just a legal verdict. It represented the intersection of America's most troubling tendencies around race, class, and criminal justice. Williams, a young black man with a criminal record, faced a jury for the murder of Felicia Gayle, a respected white professional. The optics alone carried weight that transcended the actual evidence presented. But perhaps most significantly, the conviction occurred in Missouri, a state with a complicated history regarding capital punishment. Missouri had been among the states most eager to resume executions after the Supreme Court lifted its moratorium in 1976, and had developed a reputation for carrying out death sentences with relatively few delays. Williams would spend the next 23 years learning just how difficult it would be to overcome a death sentence in such a system, even with evidence supporting his claims of innocence. Years passed before the breakthrough that would transform Williams' case from a routine death penalty appeal into a national controversy. As DNA technology advanced and became more sophisticated, it became possible to test genetic material that earlier methods couldn't analyze effectively. When that testing was finally conducted on evidence from Gayle's murder, the results were stunning. Bell filed a motion to vacate the capital murder conviction. Bell said a DNA analysis excluded Williams as the source of DNA on the murder weapon, and that his predecessors in the office made constitutional errors that contributed to a faulty murder conviction. Wesley Bell, the St. Louis County prosecutor, wasn't just any official calling for Williams' conviction to be overturned. He represented the same office that had originally sought Williams' execution. This wasn't a case of an activist prosecutor trying to make a political point. This was a prosecutor examining the evidence with fresh eyes and concluding that his office had gotten it wrong. The DNA evidence didn't just fail to implicate Williams. It actively excluded him as the source of genetic material found on the murder weapon. The state destroyed or corrupted the evidence that could conclusively prove his innocence, and the available DNA and other forensic crime scene evidence does not match him. Even the victim's family believes life without parole is the appropriate sentence. The destruction of evidence that might have proven Williams' innocence added another layer of controversy to an already complex case. The family's position was particularly significant. Felicia Gayle's relatives, who had lived with the trauma of her murder for more than 2 decades, were now publicly stating that they believed life imprisonment without parole was more appropriate than execution. This wasn't a family seeking vengeance. This was a family grappling with the possibility that the wrong person had been convicted of their loved one's murder. As news of the DNA evidence spread, Williams' case attracted attention far beyond Missouri's borders. Social media campaigns sprouted calling for clemency. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of executing someone when DNA evidence raised such serious questions about their guilt. The case caught the attention of high-profile advocates who began using their platforms to raise awareness about Williams' situation. The involvement of celebrities and activists wasn't unusual in death penalty cases, but added another dimension to the public pressure surrounding Williams' scheduled execution. When DNA evidence proves innocence, capital punishment is not justice, it is murder. This sentiment, expressed by advocates for Williams, captured the moral complexity of his case. If the evidence truly supported his innocence claims, then proceeding with the execution would represent something far worse than a wrongful conviction. It would represent state-sanctioned killing of an innocent person. The legal maneuvering became increasingly desperate as Williams' execution date approached. With no DNA evidence pointing to any alternative suspects, the lawyers reached a compromise with the prosecutor's office. Williams would enter a new no-contest plea to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence without parole. A no-contest plea is not an admission of guilt, but is treated as such for sentencing purposes. This compromise represented a remarkable acknowledgement by the prosecutor's office that they no longer had confidence in the original conviction. But it also highlighted the tragic irony of Williams' situation. Even with the prosecutor seeking to overturn his conviction, even with DNA evidence supporting his innocence claims, even with the victim's family opposing his execution. The system still seemed determined to carry out the death sentence. As September 24th, 2024 dawned, Marcellus Williams likely knew that his 26-year fight was nearing its end. The appeals had been exhausted. The Supreme Court had declined to intervene. Governor Mike Parson had refused to grant clemency. The machinery of execution, once set in motion, had proven impossible to stop. Williams spent his final day in the same way he had spent much of his time on death row, in prayer and reflection with his imam. His conversion to Islam had been one of the most significant developments of his decades in prison, providing him with both spiritual comfort and a framework for understanding his circumstances. The faith that had sustained him through more than 2 decades of incarceration would sustain him through these final hours. His final meal reflected both his faith and perhaps a desire for something comforting in his last moments. At exactly 6 p.m., the process began. Williams was strapped to a gurney in Missouri's execution chamber, IVs inserted into his arms, ready to receive the lethal injection that would end his life. The witnesses, required by law to observe the state's ultimate punishment, watched as Williams prepared to speak his final words. "All praise be to Allah in every situation," Williams whispered. These words, simple yet profound, encapsulated both his faith and his acceptance of circumstances beyond his control. They weren't words of anger or bitterness. Despite spending more than half his life on death row for a crime he insisted he didn't commit, they were words of submission to a divine will that transcended human justice. The pentobarbital began flowing through the 4 lines at 6 p.m. exactly. Within minutes, Williams' breathing became shallow, then stopped altogether. At 6:10 p.m., he was pronounced dead. The controversy that swirled around his case for years died with him, at least officially. But the questions his execution raised would long outlive the man himself.